excited so you can get a jump start on it. But we're going to be in the first couple of chapters of Micah. During the Iranian hostage crisis, which I know many of y'all lived through that time, and you can remember what it was like turning on the TV or waiting on the news to find out what was going on. But during the Iranian hostage crisis, a preacher by the name of Greg Livingston was asked to give, at that time, what was known as a missions minute. There was a large church on the East Coast that would host these missions minute, and they would bring in people to speak for just 60 seconds. And so he was brought in with only 1 minute to speak. He decided that with what time he had, he wanted to ask 2 questions. So he stood before about 4,000 people assembled that night, and he said, first of all, I want to ask you this. How many of you are praying for the 52 Americans that are being held in Iran? And it's reported that all 4,000 hands in the building immediately went up. And so he said, of course, that's what I think the whole country is doing. He said, so put your hands down and let me ask you a follow-up question. He said, how many of you are praying for the 42 million Iranians being held hostage to Islam every single day? It's reported that 4 hands in that building went up. To which point, Greg Livingston responded, what are you guys? Americans first and Christians second? I thought this was a Bible-believing church. And while I think there's room enough to preach a whole sermon on that point of being Americans first and Christians second, I just wanted to back up and point out that's just a stinging rebuke, isn't it? I mean, to stand there in front of 4,000 people, 3,996 of whom just got put in their place, that's quite a rebuke from the preacher. But no one likes to be rebuked. Nobody likes to be put in their place, but sometimes that's just what has to happen. Sometimes there is a need for that. When the American church at large would pray for these 52 people, which is great, but think nothing of each and every day, millions of people are literally enslaved to a religion like Islam. And he said, we ought to be praying for this. And he put those people in their place. Now, we don't like to be rebuked, but sometimes that's what needs to happen. And so God used his prophets more often than not to bring a rebuke to his people. Usually a message nobody wanted to hear. Usually a message that was not well received. Now, they would sprinkle in some good news. They would usually put a little bit of hope into their message, but most of what they said was a stinging rebuke to the people that were supposed to be God's people, God's chosen nation. And so tonight, we're going to see that God used Micah, the prophet Micah, to bring a stinging rebuke to his people. Now, I said this morning, and I will say it again in case you didn't hear, that yes, we finished Hosea last week, and I planned on going in the order that the minor prophets appear in the Bible, but with Christmas, Micah is the one who talks about Bethlehem. He gives us the clue that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. We're not going to look at that tonight, but we will next week, and so next week will be our last Sunday night message before Christmas with our candlelight service and things. So next week we will talk about the baby born in Bethlehem that Micah points to. So I decided to go with Micah now, so we can have that as our, if you will, our Christmas message next week. So with that said, if you were in Micah chapter 1, the plan tonight is to cover the first 3 chapters and then to finish it next week. But we're going to look as Micah uses his words to take Israel to different scenes that would have been very familiar to them. I love Micah because he is a wordsmith. Micah does so much, and a lot of it gets lost in English, the word plays he makes, and I'm going to try to point out a lot of that we only see in Hebrew. But Micah is so good with his words. He would be like the Max Lucado of the prophets as far as being a storyteller, only much more of a rebuke than what Max Lucado normally dishes out. His aren't just nice flowery stories like Lucado, and I'm not putting Lucado down, that's his gift, that's what he does. Micah is called on to rebuke the nation of Israel, but he does it with such great language. And so the first thing that we're going to see tonight is that Micah takes Israel into court. He uses his words to paint a courtroom setting. So if you're in the first chapter, let's begin reading in the 2nd verse. He says, "Hear, you people, all of you, pay attention, O earth, and all that is in it, and let the Lord God be a witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple. For behold, the Lord is coming out of his place, and he will come down and tread upon the high places of the earth, and the mountains will melt like under him, and the valleys will split open like wax before the fire, like waters poured down a steep place. All of this is for the transgression of Jacob, and for the sins of the house of Israel. What is the transgression of Jacob? Is it not Samaria? And what is the high place of Judah? Is it not Jerusalem? Therefore I will make Samaria a heap in the open country, a place for planting vineyards, and I will pour down her stones into the valley and uncover her foundations. Let's go to verse 9. He says, all her carved images shall be beaten to pieces, all her wages shall be burned with fire, and all her idols I will lay waste. For from the fee of a prostitute she gathered them, and to the fee of a prostitute they shall return. For this I will lament and wail. I will go stripped and naked. I will make lamentation like the jackals, and mourning like the ostriches. For her wound is incurable, and it has come to Judah. It has reached to the gate of my people, to Jerusalem. In verse 2, when he begins with the word here, he's giving a legal summons. Micah is now using language that was used, especially in the Old Testament days, in courtroom proceedings. And in fact, he even uses the word witness in a minute, because he's calling the Lord as a witness to take the stand and be a witness against Israel. That's not a witness I would want testifying against me if I were on the stand. You know, the beauty of the New Testament is it presents Satan as the one who's the accuser of the church. Satan is the one who will bring charges against us and say, well, God, I remember that time that he told that lie, and I remember the time that she did this or they did that, and I remember that. But who comes to our defense in the New Testament? We have an advocate, the Bible says, a defense attorney, and it is Jesus Christ the righteous. He will be in our corner if we are Christians. But here we see the exact opposite. Micah says, the Lord himself will take the stand, and he will be the witness against you. And he tells them exactly why. Because of their idolatry. He mentions their idols. And when the Lord begins to be the witness and say, that's right, I was there when you bowed down to that idol. I was there when you went to see those temple prostitutes. I was there when you trusted and prayed to a piece of wood made with your own hands instead of trusting in me, the God of the covenant. I remember what you did. That would be a pretty open and shut case, wouldn't it? Micah also presents God as the judge in this courtroom setting. He says when he will come into his place from on high, and the mountains will melt like wax before him. That's quite a picture. I don't know if you've ever been in court. Maybe the average person doesn't really have the opportunity to be in court in your life, but if you ever are in court, when the judge comes in, what does everybody do? Stands up. All rise for the honorable whoever. And whether you like that judge or not, doesn't matter. That judge is honorable in his or her courtroom. And when they say all rise, when that bailiff tells you to stand up, you stand up. You don't disrespect the judge. Even if the only courtroom you know of is Judge Judy or something on TV, you know that these judges do not take anything from anyone. They say, I will not be disrespected in my courtroom. The judge is the king, and the courtroom is his domain. The judge stands sovereign in a courtroom. And when the judge walks in out of respect, everybody stands to their feet. Micah says when the Lord steps in as judge, we're not just going to stand up before him. He says the mountains will melt like wax before him. The idea is for us to understand from this picture, this vivid image of just how holy the Lord is. That you and I are not going to be able to stand in his presence. Not even the mountains can stand in his presence. Mountains are strong. They're immovable. In all of creation, mountains are some of the most majestic things that there are. In fact, many of you, whenever you get a 3-day weekend and you get some time away, you get in your car and you head for the mountains. I know a lot of people in this room, that's what you do. To me, there's no better vacation spot than Pigeon Forge. I love to go to the mountains. They're beautiful. There's just something breathtaking about the mountains. All 4 seasons, doesn't matter when you go, the mountains are impressive. The mountains will take your breath away. I'll sit in a hotel room with a cup of coffee and just look at mountains. They are so majestic. And Micah says, when the Lord walks into his courtroom, the mighty mountains will drip and melt like wax before a fire. Next time you light a candle in your house, anybody have any Christmas candles going? I was going to say right now, not right this very minute. Don't leave candles burning if you're not at home. That's a public service announcement. But maybe you've got some Christmas candles or something burning at your house this time of year, and you see those little drops of wax start to go down. And the longer they burn, the shorter that candle becomes. And next time you look at a candle getting smaller and smaller, and you see that wax running down, I want you to picture the mountains dripping like wax before God. That is the power of God, the holiness of God. And when he walks into the courtroom to judge, he is both judge and witness, it's going to be an open and shut case. Israel will have no chance when God walks into the courtroom that day. In verse 6, he gives us the verdict. He says, I will make Samaria a heap in the open country, a place for planting vineyards. I will pour down her stones into the valley and uncover her foundations. He's saying, you're guilty. And here's the sentence. Here's what I'm going to do. Those idols are going to receive the death sentence. Those very idols that you have bowed down to, capital punishment. I am sentencing them to death, is what God says. And it would be foolish for anybody to put their faith and their trust in those idols when God has given them the death sentence. But in reality, they were never alive to start with. And yet people were putting all their faith and their trust in idols made by human hands. And God says, you're guilty. You're guilty of your idolatry. And now Micah, who is a wordsmith, finds himself at a loss for words. I don't even know what to say. So what does he say? I'm going to weep and howl like wild animals. I'm just going to moan and make unintelligible noises. I find myself stripped naked, he says, which wasn't completely naked. In Hebrew, it's more like, it's basically like a loincloth, would have been like the equivalent of undergarments in their day, but it's a sign of being in great mourning. I don't even feel like getting dressed. I'm not going to get up in the morning and do my hair or my makeup. I'm not going to get dressed and go out. I just want to lay here in bed and cry all day, making animal noises. What Micah says, he is so distressed by what Israel has done. And I love what he does beginning in verse 10. If you want to follow along these next few verses, this is an example of how Micah is a wordsmith. We probably won't catch this the first time through reading it in English, but I want to try my best to explain to you what he's doing here. In verse 10, speaking of Israel's sin and the punishment that's coming, he says, tell it not in Gath. Weep not at all in Bethlehem. Roll yourselves in the dust. Pass on your way, inhabitants of Shaphir, in nakedness and in shame. The inhabitants of Zana do not come out. The lamentation of Beth Ezel shall take away from all you its standing place. For the inhabitants of Maroth wait anxiously for good, because disaster has come down from the Lord to the gate of Jerusalem. Harness the steeds to the chariots, inhabitants of Lachish. It was the beginning of sin to the daughter of Zion, for in you were found the transgression of Israel. He first mentions Gath. And by the way, all these cities he mentions here are all within a 10-mile radius of Micah's hometown. Verse 1 tells us where he's from, and if you were to just draw a circle around his home city, each of these cities that he mentions here are the ones that he addresses. And with each of these words, he's making a play on words in the Hebrew language, whether he makes a pun based on the definition of the city name, or else he takes a homonym, a rhyming word, for what that city sounds like, and he makes a pun based on that. So first of all, he mentions Gath. Gath in Hebrew, it doesn't mean to speak, but it sounds like the Hebrew word that does mean to speak or to tell. So he says, tell it not in Gath. That would have been a rhyming word in Hebrew, and it would have been a really clever play. Do not tell it in Gath, he says. Nobody wants to hear such bad news, so you don't tell them in Gath the bad news of what I'm here to say. The next city he mentions, Beth-le-Ephra. It means house of dust. And Micah says, roll yourselves in the dust, which is just kind of getting down and dirty, kind of giving up. But he's making a play off of the name of the city. Then he mentions Shaphir, which in Hebrew means pleasant or beautiful. But he tells them that the inhabitants would not look pleasant or beautiful as they're stripped of their clothes and led off into captivity naked. Zain in the next city means to come out, but its residents would not be able to come outside because of the danger in the city. They would be so afraid of the disaster and the calamity that they would stay inside with the doors bolted shut. Then he mentions Beth Ezel. It means in Hebrew, house of taking away. And the inhabitants there would have their security, he says, taken away. Then he mentions Maroth, which is associated with bitterness. You see Meribah and related words like that in Scripture. Mara means bitterness. And so he says that they will be anxiously awaiting good, but because of the bitterness that will come upon them. And then my favorite, Lachish, in Hebrew is the word that refers to a team of horses. And he says to saddle up your horses, to harness your steeds, he says to the chariots. In other words, try to escape before disaster comes. In each one of these, he's making a clever play on words that the people who heard what he had to say would be struck by what he said. He's saying it is going to be so bad what God is going to do because of the idolatry. Now God was the judge, and Micah was the faithful prophet, but that did not keep him from lamenting the city and encouraging them to repent. What we know of God is always true. If they would have listened to Micah and said, oh my goodness, we don't want that to happen to us, let us turn from our idols. Boy, the second they would have done that, like Jonah will do in Nineveh, though it's a terrible city, the minute they believe and they repent, God relents of the calamity that he said he would bring upon them. And if the people in Israel would have just repented, then none of these things would have happened. Micah has used his words to take them to court. Next, he uses words to take them into the chapel. He takes them to a chapel where both weddings and funerals are performed. And we see another wordplay here in verse 14 of chapter 1. He says, therefore you shall give parting gifts to Moresheth Gath. The house of Akzib shall be a deceitful thing to the kings of Israel. The city he mentions here, Moresheth, it sounds like the Hebrew word that means to be betrothed. How you would think of getting engaged today. So he says you are going to pay parting gifts to those who are betrothed. Now, of course, that's what we do here in America too. The father of the bride, has maybe the bittersweet job. Maybe it's not even sweet, I don't know, but has the job of giving away his daughter in marriage, right? And so we say, I would imagine there wouldn't be anything sweet about it. To me, it just seems bitter, but I don't know. Even if you love your new son-in-law, fathers, you're still giving away your daughter. That has to be such a hard thing to do, and then watch her go on and live with somebody else. It's like my little girl is now going off with someone else. And so he's making a pun here, saying like, just as a young lady's betrothed and then given away, and then the father would give parting gifts to his daughter. Not only does he give her away, but then he gives her like a housewarming gift or whatever it might be. But think about how that's doubly sad for the father. Not only do I give away my daughter, I also give her things as I watch her go away. And he says, Israel, this is what's going to happen to you. He is saying that you are going to lose your land, this promised land. And not only are you going to lose the land that the Lord your God has given you, but you are going to pay parting gifts as you go. That probably didn't make a whole lot of sense at the time, but we know from history, after the Assyrian army came in and led them off as captives, then they forced the Israelites to pay tribute money or taxes to them. So in essence, that's what happened. They gave away their land because of their sin, and then they paid the parting gifts. They paid the tribute money to the very people who took their land from them. Just as a father would give gifts, really to the man who's taking his daughter, he's saying, you're going to give gifts to the king who's taking your land. And so he's painting a wedding scene here, but it's not a very happy wedding scene that he paints. But then after we see what he paints here in this wedding, and I should mention too, he mentions Akzib here, the next city, and that in Hebrew means deceitful. And he says that we know that Israel had a military outpost in the city, and they put all of their trust in their military strength. But he says, it is deceitful to you. You're trusting in your military, but when the Assyrian army comes, you're going to find that you will be defeated. So what you're trusting in is deceitful to you, and it will not save you. Now he puts away the white wedding decorations, and he brings out the blackness of a funeral. He shifts gears after this verse, and in chapter 2, as we make our way to chapter 2, we see language of a funeral. Look at verse 3. He says, therefore, thus says the Lord, behold, against this family I am devising disaster, from which you cannot remove your necks, and you shall not walk haughtily, for it will be a time of disaster. In that day they will take up a taunt song, that's a funeral song, against you, and they will moan bitterly and say, we are utterly ruined. He changes the portions of my people, how he removes it from me to an apostate. He allots our fields. He's now addressing the economic power brokers we see here in the first couple of verses of this chapter. And he's basically saying this: you rich people are making the rich richer and the poor poorer by breaking all of the protections that God had put into the law and into the covenant. If they would have lived by Moses' law, there would be no rich class, there would be no poor class, and everybody would be pretty much the same. This is not socialism, by the way. It's very different, but I won't even get into that tonight. But if they would have lived according to the law, this wouldn't have happened. But he's saying, you are not doing it the way that God has said. And he says, I am devising disaster against you. In other words, it's like God saying, I am going in right now to try to brainstorm and cook up something really bad to do to you. I am trying to come up with calamity, disaster. And whatever I decide to do, it's not going to be pretty. And then in verse 4 it says the people will sing a funeral song. And they will be singing their funeral song, wailing and moaning bitterly over the economic state of the nation. Think Black Friday, or Black Tuesday. What was it when the stock market crashed?
Black Tuesday.
Black Tuesday, thank you. Who said that? Oh, of course, Cindy, thank you. Got to have the history teacher in here. But Black Tuesday before the stock market crashed. And think what happened to America during that Great Depression. And think of everything associated with that. You are going to be mourning, singing a funeral song, basically having a funeral for your own economy after the Lord is done with you. And so now he moves from the chapel to the church. Beginning in verse 6, Michael begins to sound like a good old-fashioned southern foot-stomping preacher as he begins to call out the sins of the people. In verse 6 he says this, still in chapter 2. He says, "Do not preach." Thus they preach. "One should not preach of such things. Disgrace will not overtake us. Should this be said, O house of Jacob? Has the Lord grown impatient? Are these his deeds? Do not my words do good to him who walks uprightly? But lately my people have risen up as an enemy. You strip the rich robe from those who pass by, trustingly with no thought of war. The women of my people you drive out from their delightful houses. From their young children you take away my splendor forever. Arise and go." This is punishment language here. "Arise and go, for this is no place of rest, because of uncleanness that destroys with a grievous destruction. If a man should go about and utter wind and lies, saying, I will preach to you of wine and strong drink, he would be the preacher for this people. I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will gather the remnant of Israel. I will set them together like sheep in a fold, like a flock in its pasture, a noisy multitude of men." And he goes on and he continues to list specifically things that they have done and to tell them what their punishment would be. I understand that some of this is confusing, but what most people believe what was happening here is that these rich landowners who owned slaves would send their slaves out to war in their place. Of course, we haven't even seen this in American history. But so a landowner would say, all right, slave, it's time to go to war, so you're going to go fight. And then when the slaves would come back, like what was customary, is the winning side would take the spoil. They would grab money, clothes, food, anything they wanted to take from who they defeated, and they'd bring it back. So here come the slaves home from war victorious with pockets full of cash, and then these rich landowners would say, yeah, I'm going to take all that spoil because you're my slave, so all your stuff is basically mine. And the women and the children that were even left behind during these times of battle, the ones that were maybe children of slaves, the same thing. They were dealing very harshly with each one of them. And then when they would send the slaves, maybe they were not their slaves, but they lived on land and farmed land that these rich landowners owned. They would go off to war, they would come back, and these landowners would say, you know what, while you were gone, you weren't able to plant any crops, you weren't able to make any money off my land, so I'm going to have to evict you now and take my land back and sell it to someone else. And so they were manipulating the people, the poorest, the most vulnerable people that lived on their land, completely taking advantage of them. Now I realize tonight I'm not preaching to a group of wealthy landowners. I realize I'm not talking to slave owners. You might be sitting here thinking, boy, that's terrible, but that doesn't apply to us, so we're off the hook tonight. And you know what, maybe you are, but I will still present this question to you tonight. What are you doing to help those who are in need? Maybe you're not kicking them off of land, but when you have an opportunity to meet needs, are you a generous person? See, the Old Testament had these laws in place, and they were disregarding them. But all through the New Testament, we continually see commands to do good and to share. I like how Paul says, do good and share. Like we tell our toddlers that, we don't outgrow the need to do good and to share. Sharing is not just for little kids. We need to share. We need to be generous to people. All through the New Testament, we see this principle that we cannot be too generous. We cannot outgive God. And so what do you do for those who are less fortunate? In what ways do you help out people that might be down on their luck, might be down and out? Are you a generous person? Micah is having to scold and rebuke the nation of Israel because their wealthiest were not being generous at all. In fact, they were taking advantage of the people when they were in their greatest time of need. In verse 10, he says, arise and go. You know what's happening here? The Lord is telling them, hey, you landowners, you're kicking people off of your land right and left. Well, guess what? That land doesn't actually belong to any of you landowners. God is saying that land is mine. Of course, we know the whole earth is the Lord's. It's his footstool. We know that he owns everything. He's spoken into existence. But that promised land was not theirs because they earned it. It was theirs because God was gracious. And so long as they lived according to the covenant, he allowed them to live there. But God is saying, time's up. You are living in my land, but you're not living by my laws. So arise and go. Your days of living in my promised land have come to an end. You are going to be kicked off of your land in the very same way that you kicked the poor off of your land. I'm now kicking you off of yours. In verse 10, he says, arise and go. And he says, this is not a place of rest. That was the whole purpose of the promised land. We see that all through the Old Testament, all through the book of Hebrews, that God has always been about rest. The promised land was a place of rest. Every 7 days, what do? You rest. That's what the Sabbath is all about. Every 7 years, what do? You rest. A whole year off. Are you kidding me? And yet they wouldn't even do that because they wanted to make more and more and more money. They become so greedy. The land is supposed to rest. You're supposed to rest every 7 days, every 7 years, every 7 sevens, every 50th year, a year of Jubilee. All these things they were ignoring. And God says this is supposed to be a place of rest. You're supposed to have a rest from your enemies and live at peace. You're supposed to have a rest with each other and everybody get along. Financial rest. Everything about life is supposed to be about peace and rest. And this land is no longer that. So arise and go. God's saying it is time for you to move on. It is a very sad sight to picture Israel having to be marched off of that promised land. But that's what happens. Again, we might not be guilty of doing exactly what they were doing, but Israel had become unclean before a holy God. What they had done was about idolatry. What they had done specifically was about bowing down to idols. And we probably don't bow down to the Baals and the Asherahs in life, but are we living a holy life before God? Are we living by his covenant commands today? Are we living by the 10 commandments? Are we living by the golden rule? Are we living by the great commandment to love God and love others? Are we doing those things today, church? Because I believe that as strongly as God used Micah to rebuke Israel, I believe he would rebuke the church all the same today if we deviate from what God has told us to do. Nobody's perfect. But more often than not, consistently, are we trying to live the way that God said to live? Israel had gotten away from that, and so punishment was coming. So we close tonight by looking at one last scene that Micah paints. First, he uses words to take him to court. Then he took him to chapel, where there was a wedding and a funeral. Then he took him to the church, where he called out their sin. And finally, he takes them to the kitchen. More specifically, he takes them to the cauldron. In chapter 3, let's read the first 3 verses, and we will close. He says, "Hear, you heads of Jacob, and rulers of the house of Israel, is it not for you to know justice? You who hate good and love evil, who tear the skin off of my people, and their flesh from off their bones, who eat the flesh of my people, and flay their skin from off them, and break their bones in pieces, and chop them up like meat in a pot, like flesh in a cauldron." And he goes on in the rest of this chapter, and again, it's just classic Micah. He's a wordsmith. The way he continues to speak here is incredible. But I want us to close by looking at this cauldron scene that he paints here, even describing the leaders of Israel as cannibalizing their own people. Pretty gruesome to think about what he's accused them of doing. Obviously, it's not physical cannibalism, but he says that's what you're doing to your people. He addresses this final part to the leaders of Israel, but in Hebrew he uses a very unique word. Even in his day it was archaic. It was a word that nobody used anymore to refer to their rulers. The only way I can think to translate it in English would be like how a long time ago, before there was meteorology and meteorologists, what did you call the people on TV that gave you the weather? You simply called them the weatherman, right? You remember those days? And now we have meteorologists. I'm the chief meteorologist for this station. And so somebody now has gotten a meteorology degree, and they've got a lot more training. And instead of calling them a meteorologist, you keep calling them a weatherman, right? So imagine this person is chief meteorologist, and they're wrong day after day after day after day. And so instead of trying to dignify them and call them a meteorologist, you call them a weatherman. And maybe that's like a sarcastic jab at saying, you don't have a clue what you're talking about. You got all that science, but you're always wrong. And I believe that's why Micah did what he did. He picked a word for the leaders that nobody used anymore, and I think he was saying, you're not acting right. You're not acting like the leaders of Israel should, and I'm not going to dignify you by using the actual word that everybody else would use to describe them. And so he addresses this final part to these leaders, and he begins by telling them that they're not doing it right. And in graphic detail, he portrays them as cannibalizing God's people. Israel should have been able to trust that their leaders had their best interests at heart, but we understand that that's not what was happening. He says that the leaders of Israel loved evil and hated the good. You love what is evil and you hate that which is good. We see similar language in the Old Testament in Isaiah 5:20. He says, "Woe to those who call good evil and evil good." He's talking to ancient Israel, but I think he could just as easily be talking to the average American. I believe he could be talking to a lot of lukewarm church members. You out in the pews who call evil good and good evil. Haven't we gotten it backwards as a country? Doesn't it seem like the things we celebrate the most are those that are the most wicked? The things that we once applauded in this country, we mock and we put down. We tell people, if you believe in that stuff, you go to church, you believe in the Bible, well, that stuff's just all, old school, it's out of date, that was for another time, that stuff's all archaic. And instead, we promote everything that the Bible speaks against. Think about what happens in America when we put the Kardashians on a pedestal and we mock Mike Pence. As Americans, we tell people like Tim Tebow, keep your faith to yourself and shut up and play football. And then the President of the United States calls Jason Collins, who comes out of the closet in the NBA, and congratulates him on being the first openly gay pro basketball player. If you're wondering which president that was, I'll tell you later if you don't know. But that's what we do in America. Oh, Tebow, keep your faith to yourself. Oh, congratulations on being gay. What is wrong with us? I mean, how have we gotten it so backwards? We call good evil, and we call evil good. In America, the things that make people blush, or should make people blush, we now have parades for. Things that should not be spoken of in public are now trending on social media. All the while, the only real hope for this country has been removed from public schools, removed from the courthouse, and removed from the public in general. You know what's wrong with America? We have less and less and less God. And the more we remove God, the more godless we become, and the further down that wrong path we go. And we say, boy, what is the only hope for America? Well, it's the very God that we are removing. We say drastic times call for drastic measures. Maybe we need to put God back on campus. To me, we never should have removed him to start with. The only reason we have drastic times is because they tried to fix what was not broken. When God was openly talked about, when we prayed before school started, when it was okay to carry your Bibles, when it was expected that people would go to church, when we lived our Christian values, and everybody, now of course America was not perfect during those times. I'm not trying to say that at all. I'm not trying to say I want to go back to days when women couldn't vote and when we didn't have civil rights. I'm not talking about any of that stuff. But morally, my goodness, we go farther and farther and farther from God, calling what is good evil, and celebrating evil and calling it good. We think it's a sign of progress in our country that people can do whatever they want to do. I believe that God would send someone like Micah back today to say, woe to you, the leaders, the pastors that endorse it, the leaders, the politicians, the justices that say, this is okay, this is good, this is constitutional, this is what we should be doing. Maybe you want to go to the women's bathroom, have at it, that's progress. I believe God would send a leader today that say, you are cannibalizing your people, you are chopping them up like meat in a cauldron, you are destroying them and saying it is good all the while. What kind of leaders would do that? In verse 12, he closed chapter 3, we won't read it, but in verse 12 he says that the field will be plowed up and left as a heap of ruin. We know what happened to ancient Israel. We know what fate they met. They chose not to repent, and everything that God said would happen, happened. Why is America any different? Why should we be any different when we don't live according to God's laws? I said the other Wednesday night that if America doesn't repent, if God doesn't do to us what he did to some of these ancient cities, I said God would owe Sodom and Gomorrah an apology if he lets us continue in sin after what he did to Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, I do believe that because there's a remnant here, they couldn't find a remnant there. God couldn't find 10 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah. There was no remnant in ancient Israel outside of the prophets. We have a remnant here in America. And so, church, we have a grave responsibility that we have to continue to be that remnant. We must stand firm as the church. I'm not talking about being obnoxious and waving signs and protesting parades. I'm saying let's just let our light so shine before men. You know what this world needs from us, church? They don't need us to shut up. They need us to speak up now more than ever. They don't need us to go away. They need us to stand up for what we believe in. This world needs us to let our light so shine. This world needs us to be the salt of the earth. This world needs us to be the light of the world. This world needs us to do everything decently and in order. This world needs us to do all things without grumbling and complaining. This world needs us to love our neighbor as ourselves. This world needs us to be generous and to share. This world needs us to be a sweet-smelling aroma before our God. We may not be able to save America and turn the tide back, but we can make a difference right here as individuals and as the church where God has planted us. And so we may get frustrated looking around nationally. God hasn't asked us to do something about nationally. He's asked us to make a difference right here where he has put us. In our Jerusalem first. To the doors and the houses that are around the Putman community. And it starts right here. And as we make a difference here, then we begin to expand out. If this whole community, if this whole county began turning to Christ and we continued working our way outward, we would reach our state. We would reach this region. We would reach our country. We would reach the world. I can't do anything about what they do in Congress, but I can make a difference where I live. You can make a difference at your office. You can make a difference in your street. You can make a difference on your campus. You can make a difference with your family. He's called us to simply make a difference right where we live. And I believe that we can do that, church. I'm going to ask you to stand tonight with your heads bowed and your eyes closed. Miss Nancy's going to begin to play. Maybe tonight you want to ask the Lord to help you make a difference right where you are. Maybe tonight He's convicted you about something that you're doing or not doing. Maybe it's like, I haven't been very generous. I haven't really had a heart or compassion for those less fortunate. This holiday season, I've been buying gifts for everyone on my list. I haven't really thought about those who are going without this year. Maybe God's encouraging you to step out of your comfort zone and to help somebody. Maybe He's laid something on your heart. The altar is open. As we pray, use this time to talk to Him. Father, I pray that if you have convicted us or challenged us, that we would do whatever you may be leading us to do right now. God, if someone wants to come down here and kneel, I pray that they would, or talk to somebody, pray with somebody, I pray that they would. But Lord, whatever may be on our hearts right now, I thank you that you're a God who listens and that we can talk to you about it. So I say this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. With the piano playing, the altar is open. Use this time to talk to the Lord.